Hello and welcome from the beautiful Amsterdam. I am Niels ten Hoever and I'm going to give you a short introduction to standardization as preparation for the workshop on international standard setting that we'll have with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on September 11 and 12 in The Hague and in Utrecht. I am Niels ten Hoever and I'm an assistant professor of AI and European democracies with the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the University of Amsterdam. And my other two co-PIs at the Critical Infrastructure Lab are Fieke Jansen and Maxikas, who will also be meeting on Monday. So standardization, you might think, and it's often depicted as this boring thing. If you remember, and maybe you've seen it, the Star Wars series Andor, when one of the main characters, protagonists, gets a punishment for bad behavior, he gets sent to the Imperial Bureau of Standards. And arguably, even academics agree with this. So people who study infrastructure and standards call to study boring things. But we don't study boring things because they are boring, but because infrastructure sets the invisible rules that govern the spaces of our everyday lives. And the changes to the globalizing world are being written not in the language of law and diplomacy, but rather in the language of infrastructure. And if the language of change in a globalizing world is infrastructure, then its grammar are standards. So what are standards and norms? Well, a technical standard is an established norm or requirement for a repeatable technical task which is applied to a common and repeated use of rules, conditions, guidelines, or characteristics for product or related processes and production methods and related management system practices. But more simply said, standards are established guidelines or specifications that define how technologies should operate or interoperate. Or even simpler said, standards are an agreed way of doing things. Sometimes you also hear talk about norms, especially in Dutch. People talk about normen, and technische normen in Dutch just translates to technical standards. So these are the same things. Of course, there are also social norms, such as how to shake hands and how to greet each other. And these are also kinds of social standards that exist. So you might notice, and especially directly after COVID, it was hard to do a standard negotiation. So are we going to shake hands? Are we going to hug? Are we going to nod? Are we just going to give a box? And sometimes we would negotiate and agree, and sometimes there would be a protocol failure and there would be no interoperation. But ideally, it allows us to do things and have clear expectations and also establish that this is a repeated way of doing, and thus we can trust how things are done repeatedly. So standard setting is the process of developing these standards. Then there's also talk of de jure standards, and these are standards that are mandated by law or standards that are developed by a publicly mandated institution. And what's that? I'll talk about a bit later. A de facto standard is a standard that has become accepted in practice, but has not undergone any formal process to obtain consensus and may not even have publicly available documentation. It just became there because of habit or market dominance. In principle, standards are voluntary, unless they are enforced by laws or regulations. So when does this whole thing of standardization start? Well, for that, we need to go back almost 3 centuries BC in what we now know as Pakistan, in the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, where people already made bricks and agreed on prices and sizes to stimulate trade. And this is still what standard setting is very good for. This is why standard setting is often also led by industry organizations, because it allows, and this is quite a miracle, to have competitors work together in the developing of a common standards, and that creates then healthier markets, because not everyone uses their own technology stack, but there are agreed ways of interconnecting. And here in Europe, we also have this example, and you might recognize this from the marketplace in Pompeii, where you see the standard weights of what a kilo of grain, what would the size of it be, to ensure that in trade there are no conflicts. And if we then go to a bit more modern time, this was done in a bit more precision with the French Revolution, when science became more of a public thing and not controlled by the church, but through science. There became this norm, there we have the word norm again, the standard for what a kilo would be. And that would be a golden standard. And this first kilo was actually made of gold. But if we look at modern standardization as we know it now in standard setting and standard institutions, there are three big examples that happened first. Namely, the standardization of screw heads. You might be a bit confused about how many screw heads exist now, but previously every screw factory had its own screw threads and screw heads. And then with standardization, there was agreement on one screw head. But then again, standards proliferated. But at least now there is a relatively stable number of screw heads you can use. So this allowed for interoperation, so that you would not need an infinite set of screwdrivers, and you'd always be able to use your own screwdriver set to be able to fix a screw. Then there was also a thing that happened a lot, and as you see this in this image, and that was accidents with exploding steamboats. And therefore, standards were developed for the thickness of steam engine walls to prevent explosions like this from happening. So standards also provide a means of safety and of quality. And thirdly, that's also an example of quality, the rails. So rails used to be made of different kinds of steel, but only until a standard was made for what kind of steel would be used and the thickness of the rail, it amazingly increased performance, but also interoperability. There's also another interoperability example of interoperability when it comes to rails, and that's the rail's width. And some countries might choose explicitly to not be interoperable. For instance, Poland chose not to be interoperable with Russia by using another width of trade tracks because it didn't want easy access of Russian trains to Poland. And in the current geopolitical situation, that's very understandable that they made that choice. So we talked about some standards, but some other very common standards that you all use very regularly are, for instance, 5G and Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, HTTP on the internet, USB, but also TLS and SSL, known for the S in HTTP. So you use standards every day, and these standards get produced in many different ways, shapes, or forms. And how these standards proliferate, we've already seen it with the screw heads. There are existing standards, and then people say, it's really weird that there are so many standards. We should create a universal one. And then next, you have 15 competing standards. And one, because every standard believes it might be better than the other one. But then it's up to the market, because as we said, standards are voluntary unless they are mandated by law, to decide which standard is going to rule. And as we said, we've been standardizing for a very long time, but we still don't really understand standard setting, because actually most standards fail. And there are many examples where standardization would have been great, but where it has actually failed quite badly. For instance, electrical sockets. And this you know as a traveler. But then there are also examples where the market did not really allow for the convergence on a standard, but then law help it come about. For instance, in the case of USB-C chargers. But now we also already see divergence on the USB-C chargers, that every phone now pretty much supports USB-C charging, but they need a special adapter to have fast charging. So you see that a standard can allow for particular use, but then also new uses are invented that the old standard might actually not cater for, and then soon you'll have a new standard. So standard setting is never really done, such as technology development never really is done. If we look back at the generations of standard setting, and it all started off with national standards bodies, such as the British Standards Institute, das Deutsche Institut für Normierung, and het Nederlands Instituut voor Normalisatie, NEN. Many of these bodies came up in the 18th or 19th century as professional associations, but also as part of government quality control. And then many of these associations put themselves together in regional and global bodies, such as the IEC, the ISO, but also the oldest still functioning international organization, the International Telecommunications Union, established in 1865. But then there are also regional bodies, such as ETSI and CEN and CENELEC. We'll talk more about those. But then the third generation of standards bodies came about at the end of the 20th century, such as the Institute for Electric and Electronic Engineering, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the World Wide Web Consortium, the Third Generation Protocol Partnership, and OASIS, which are industry-led private standard organizations that generally have some other characteristics from the international standards bodies. So, international standards bodies generally adhere to rules set by the World Trade Organization, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. This means that they have some standards themselves when it comes to access, accessibility, and transparency. And interestingly, these global organizations are often linked with regional bodies. And these regional bodies are then often linked with national bodies. So standards that get developed at the global level find their way down and get translated into regional and national norms, which are often very important because only regional bodies can be referred to in law, for instance, as is the case with European harmonized standards, or sometimes also with national laws. So they need to be national standards to be referred to in national law. But it also works the other way around. Some standards get developed on the national level and then find their way up through regional bodies to global bodies to then become a global standard. And different standards bodies tend to have their different specializations. So the IEC is the International Electrotechnical Commission. ISO, you probably know from quality control and safety standards. And the ITU, you probably know from telecommunication standards. But they also do a lot more when it comes to radio spectrum, but also the dissemination of standards through the ITUD and legislation that enables this standard setting. When you then look at the private and international standards consortia, these have come up quite later and therefore also look quite a bit different. Because take, for instance, the International Telecommunications Union, which started as the International Telegraph Union. Its highest body is the Plenipotentiary Conference. And the Plenipotentiary Conference is only held every 4 years. And then the meeting takes about 3 weeks. And this was because initially people needed to come from all over the world via steamer and coaches, and then they would take a long time to have their meeting. And there would be less intersessional work, and these would be the rule-setting meeting. And it still is. Independent private consortia tend to move a lot quicker when it comes to standards development. And that's why a lot of businesses prefer the move around the fast turnaround of private standard consortia. This has left behind some of the national and international standards bodies. So when we talk about standardization, there are a lot of different practices, processes, and procedures, and different legal implications and histories that are behind them. However, the public and the private standards consortia are not completely separated, because some private standards, such as developed in the IEEE, the Institute for Electric and Electronic Engineers, that you will probably know, such as the 802.11 series, which is Wi-Fi, subsequently gets also standardized in the ITU. The 3GPP also does this with its telecommunication standards. And the 3GPP itself is an umbrella body of regional telecommunications bodies. And 1M, 2M, for instance, a body that works on IoT standards and also tries to get them through the ITU. So some private standards consortia might still be aligned with the public standardization bodies. And even if you look at a particular example, and here you see an example of a slide provided by the 3GPP, many standards bodies also liaise among each other. There are many complex relationships. So there is both inside standards bodies, there is a lot of competition and collaboration, but also between standards bodies, there's competition and collaboration. And a part of that is to try to fend off the little area that they work on. So here you see different layers of the technological stack. So you see HTTP and HTML on top, and then more physical network properties at the bottom. And you see that different standards bodies have specializations on different levels. However, some also provide functionalities that are similar to each other, and there might actually be some competition on who standardizes what. And there you see companies also quite strategically making use of that to do what is called as forum shopping. So if something doesn't work here, then they might put it there, or they might threaten to put it somewhere to get it through in another place. Having said that, having a standard by no means is a guarantee that a technology will be implemented. Actually, most standards never see widespread adoption. But when a standard sees adoption, then it often really takes off. And that is the really big incentive for people to engage in standardization. So we talked about that different standards bodies can be quite different. So there are different modes of participation. Is work mostly done in study groups and happens in person? Or is most work done via mailing lists and video calls, or maybe via code platforms such as GitHubs? Or really they rely on in-person meetings to progress? Or does intersessional work happen via mailing lists, but real decisions been made in person? That really changes the dynamic, because if you then do not have the resources to be there in person, then you might actually miss a lot. Also, good question, how conversations are archived and to whom they are accessible, and what scrutiny does the public have over these bodies, and who has the access and who sets these standards. Then who gets to participate? Who is allowed? Do you need to be sanctioned by government to participate in standard setting? What costs are there involved? We talked a bit about in-person meetings that might take a lot of flight and hotel costs, but also long meetings can be quite costly if you just think of the time you need to invest. And generally, standard setting is a very intense process. And on average, the development of a standard really depends per body, but takes between 3 to 7 years to develop. Imagine, that takes a really long time for a really long commitment to work on that. So you cannot just parachute in and hope the changes is made. Furthermore, as you probably have seen, there are so many abbreviations and such high level of technical knowledge is needed that you will mostly need at least a year to really find your way in and around a standards body. And then there are also the cultures of participation. Do people appreciate it if you are there? Is your language being spoken? And do you feel safe and secure? And are you allowed in arguing, being made felt that you really don't belong? Is this just a thing that where only large corporations that have been there for ages find a place? And who gets to speak? How does one gain formal or informal influence? How did you get to the talks in the hallway? Because sometimes with standards bodies, it might feel like everyone knows each other and you're the only one out. And then who gets to decide? How do decisions take place? Is it voting? Is it consensus? Is it by hand raise? And how does this happen? And how do you ensure that it doesn't happen when you're just out of the room? And how do external organizations get involved? Do you really need to be participating in the whole process to have influence? Or is there also a public comment period where people have access and other experts are asked for their opinion? And who has access to the standards? Are they freely available for everyone? Do you need to pay a fee? So how do we know and how do we get access to this? So, and then we talked about that standard setting can take quite a long time, but every standards body has a bit of a different process, but generally it starts with the start of a project, and then people just, working on this, on how wide the specification, what will we work on, sometimes deadlines and milestones, objectives, set when committees will meet. But for instance, in the Internet Engineering Task Force, it's much more rolling work on the mailing list. So it really depends per standards body how to develop your tactic for participation and how to follow the work that's going on. It can really depend. And then it will take meetings and draft documents, and drafts need to be added and drafts need to be made. Sometimes drafts get negotiated into meetings, but in other bodies, such as the 3GPP, you hardly see contestation on the mailing list. And if people say, I have input, people go rather to another place and work and come back when they have a solution and present that to the group. And then there are different ways to come to finalizing the draft and getting reviews from the wider community and see if there's no conflict. And also processes around intellectual property are widely discussed. Because as you can imagine, if you have, if there is a standard in which you have a patented technology that is widely used, that can result in quite a lot of money. That's why patents need to be declared in many standards processes, and depending on the standards body, there are different patent policies. But we can talk about that some other time, because there's a lot of literature and discussion on that. And then with the publication of the standard, this might seem as the end of the standardization process, but it's only the start of the application and the implementation and the uptake and perhaps future versions to ensure that it lives up to the implementation. For instance, the DNS standard has been evolving for a long time and has seen many different versions and developments over time. And of course, you also know 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. These are different families of telecommunication protocols that we've seen develop over the years. Then there is the question, are standards political? And as an academic, I would quickly respond with, it really depends on what you mean with politics. There is competition between individuals in standardization, and competition and collaboration, obviously, between companies from different countries. But there are also requests made by governments in the standardization process, for instance, for lawful intercepts that are built into almost every telecommunication stack, but not in the internet technologies. There are also formal requests made by governments to standards bodies, and some standards bodies do respond to that, and some not at all. And there are also demands made by governments through legislation or regulation, to which in the standard setting process, every solution is sought to apply for that. So here you see already how different actors can choose different modes of engagement in standard setting. And of course, technology that is standardized can provide a particular intended or unintended ordering of society. This can benefit some and impede others. For instance, it can impede network operators from seeing traffic content, and then stimulate content providers from having more precise advertisement data. It can also stimulate some behavior and inhibit other behavior when it comes to intellectual property, when it comes to file sharing, when it comes to ways of connecting. And then there's also the known and unknown impact that standards might have on society, both in terms of consumer rights, but also in legislation and human rights, for instance. And these are all still fields that are very much in development. And of course, it wouldn't be politics if also not different layers of government wouldn't respond. And here we see Thierry Breton, who only recently said that in French we say, qui fait la norme détient le marché. So who makes the standards holds the market. If we want to ensure Europe's technological sovereignty in crucial disruptive sectors such as 5G, batteries, hydrogen, or quantum technology, we must occupy the field of standard setting. We must become standard makers and not just standard takers. And he adds, we were too naive. We were open by default in the belief that things would go our way, but we can't be open at any price. Which is surprising, especially if you think that openness often is a quality of standard setting to allow for interoperation. But in a very recent article about EU internet standards, Clément Perranot and Julien Rossi write that internet standards and protocols are an integral part of mechanisms of internet governance. So standards are a part of technology governance and thus shaped by a complex web of simultaneous parallel negotiations in which states and large companies compete to define the standards of the internet for the future. And their strategies reflect competitive struggles for control of the internet and for economic dominance in the internet industry, and reflect how protocols, or even talk about protocols, can bolster and reinforce political objectives. So here you see you have interests of citizens, for instance, human rights, political objectives of governments, but also economic interests. And this puts quite some strain on the standardization process. And the question is, how will we deal with this? And what can we do in the standardization process? And what should perhaps take place in other processes? So current geopolitical pressures on standardization are, for instance, the US-China competition that we have seen with 5G and Huawei, which also allowed several European governments to follow suit, even though no explicit backdoors have been found in Huawei or 5G technology. We've seen this again with ASML, when the US government requested the Dutch government to put in a sanction for export sanctions for particular lithography machines to be exported to China. And there is EU-US economic collaboration, for instance, through the Trade and Technology Council. But at the same time, the EU is aiming to foster its internal markets, European champions, and data protection through strategic autonomy from US hyperscalers, digital sovereignty, for instance, through projects such as Gaia-X, and standardization strategies, such as been launched last year, and through Stand ICT and the high-level forum on standardization, and the NIS2 directive. At the same time, there is a fear for internet fragmentation that Russia, China, Iran, or others might break off from the internet. But for now, we see that the centripetal powers are still stronger than the centrifugal powers, and at least on the level of IP, we still have a global internet. And we also know that in the International Telecommunications Union, which is 1949, is part of the UN, liberal democracies are outnumbered. So how to prevent that standards develop in a direction that we would not want the internet and other technologies to take. And then we see with the rise of China as an economic power, an increase of their participation in standard setting. And whereas American participation and European participation in the Internet Engineering Task Force is still dominant, if we look at the patents held on 5G, we see that China there already has a dominance. And the question is, do we choose for integration to keep one global network? Or do we choose not to use particular technologies, and with whom do we ally? And what will be our idea for standardization, and what should be the policies for standards bodies to underpin that? And what does that mean for Dutch government, Dutch businesses, and Dutch civil society? So some preliminary conclusions. Standardization is an old but dynamic field of technology governance. But standardization is not the only field of technology governance. There's also national and regional regulation, trade agreements, funding, patents, procurement strategies, sanctions, spectrum allocation, and many other things. And within standardization, there are many different approaches, more or less inclusive, more or less transparent, more or less accessible. So it really depends what we do where, because different approaches to standardization result in different technological, economic, and political outcomes. And the majority of standards, interestingly, never see this widespread use. But when standards succeed, they can create better market access, allow for quality control, and stimulate interoperation and enable trust. And of course, technical standards can be viewed as a public good, because if one actor uses a standard, it doesn't diminish another actor's use of the standard. Quite the opposite, it increases it. Just as with the internet, the more people are connected to it, the more worth the network overall has. So if you want to prepare a bit more for Monday, there's a really interesting podcast by the Deutsche Institut für Normalisierung. It is in English, so have a look. There is a book on a history of standards. There is the recent paper I quoted earlier. There's also a book on recent communication standards. It's really interesting. Corinne Kath wrote an excellent work on exclusionary cultures and standardization. It's a critical infrastructure lab report. And Maxigas and I wrote an article about geopolitics and standardization. Well, on that, thanks for sticking with me until the end. And I'm greatly looking forward to see you all on Monday at 9 in The Hague. See you all then. Bye.